Good evening and welcome. My name is Cantor David Mintz. I'm the director of the Center for Prayer and Spirituality here at BJ. And thank you so much for being with us on this truly special evening. Those of you who are part of the BJ community may know that here in the Center for Prayer and Spirituality, we're preparing to launch a community project on creative ritual. This coming week, we'll be beginning the first of what we hope is a series of ritual labs, a process, a spiritual process, bringing together people who are in the midst of the same life transition, and together we'll do some learning about that transition, some training in ritual co-creation, and create together a ritual for marking that transition and elevating it into a holy place. Well, we'll be beginning with the transition of retirement. The hope is in the months and years to come to be able to explore so many other sacred moments in this way. And to help launch that project, to help elevate that conversation, we are truly blessed to have a special guest with us tonight. And I'll turn it over to Rabbi Felicia Sol to say a little bit more about our guest, Anita Diamant.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Can you hear? Fine? Great. Okay. We're not used to these. So we're really blessed to have Anita Diamant with us this evening. It's just great to be in conversation. Someone who has been influenced my own rabbinate and my own understanding of the meaning of ritual and mikvah and many other Jewish life cycle moments. So Anita Diamant was born in Brooklyn. Welcome home. Grew up in Newark, New Jersey until she was 12 when her family moved to Denver, Colorado. She graduated from Washington University in St. Louis with a degree in comparative literature and earned a master's in American literature from Binghamton University in upstate New York. In 1975, she moved to Boston, began a career in journalism, writing for local magazines and newspapers. Diamond also wrote about contemporary Jewish practice for Reform Judaism magazine, Hadassah magazine, and JewishFamily.com. Her first book, published in 1985, was The New Jewish Wedding. Raise your hand if you have read The New Jewish Wedding or influenced, okay. And a handbook that combined a contemporary sensibility, respect for tradition, and a welcoming prose style. 5 other guidebooks to Jewish life and life cycle events followed. The New Jewish Baby Book, Living a Jewish Life, Jewish Traditions, Customs, and Values for Today's Families. Choosing a Jewish Life, a handbook for people converting to Judaism and for their families and friends. Saying Kaddish, How to Comfort the Dying, Bury the Dead, and Mourn as a Jew, and How to Raise a Jewish Child. She's all you need, basically, right? In 1997, Anita published her first work of fiction inspired by a few lines from Genesis. The Red Tent tells the story of an obscure and overlooked character named Dinah, the only daughter of Jacob and Leah. Raise your hand if you read The Red Tent. The Red Tent became a word-of-mouth bestseller, as displayed here, thanks to reader recommendations, book groups, and support from independent bookstores. It's been published in more than 25 countries. And the novel was adapted as a 2-part, 4-hour miniseries by Lifetime TV. Anita has had several other books since: Good Harbor, Last Days of Dogtown, Day After Night, and The Boston Girl. And her most recent book is her first book, too. The Jewish Wedding Now is a complete revision, rethink of The New Jewish Wedding, which was first published in 1985 and updated in 2001. You'll see this is the old one that has been in my office ever since I became a rabbi, if not before. And this is the new one that just came out, amongst others. Anita Diamant is the founding president of Mayyim Hayyim, Living Waters Community Mikveh, an education center in Newton, Massachusetts, a reinvention of the ancient Jewish tradition of mikveh, ritual immersion in water. So we're really pleased to have Anita Diamant with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And the view, I've been in the pews in the past, but I've never gotten this view. It's such a beautiful,
it's a good view.
Beautiful view. Thank you for inviting me.
We're happy to have you. So I just want to open with a question of how do you think about ritual? Like when you think about what ritual is, what is it for you?
I actually brought something to you.
Yeah, I knew you were going to do that.
This is just a little thing, because I was thinking about this. And so 4 pages. There we go. So starting with spirituality, since this is sort of the rubric under which I've always had trouble with the word spirituality. I don't know what to do with it. And this is a quote from Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman in his book, The Journey Home, which kind of does it for me, says it for me, and ties it to what you've just asked. So he wrote, spirituality is a new term for Jews. Holiness we are familiar with, but spirituality is a Christian category, and Jews are in the process of translating it. Spirituality asks us to live in the world so that we can appreciate things we would not be conscious of if we were to limit ourselves to the way our secular culture perceives reality. The Jewish way of mapping this other reality includes rituals that help us appreciate things we might gloss over, or of connecting what we do and who we are to God. So for me, Jewish spirituality translates most effectively as ritual. I think ritual is super important, and that means religious gestures and ritual and enactment and religious dramaturgy, which is a word I like very much. So it's the dramatic composition and arrangement of ritual, which will have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and has an arc, and ideally moves you from one place to another emotionally, in terms of status, spiritually, in any number of ways. So to me, ritual is this. It's too close, maybe. Ritual is, for me, the most authentic expression of spirituality, also because you don't use as much language necessarily, and words get in the way, I think, of trying to approach the ineffable, the divine, whatever's holy. So words are more complicated. Gestures, lighting candles, immersing in water, even wrapping yourself in a talit and changing the space that you're in. All these physical enactments, to me, are incredible. They bear Jewish spirituality within them.
You said when we spoke on the phone a couple of weeks ago, and the term you used was embodied spirituality, which is, I thought, really compelling, since I don't think most people think of Judaism as such an embodied experience in many ways. We're a very heady religion. So I'm like, when you think about what you didn't use that term in this moment, but I'm curious, talk to me about what embodied spirituality.
Well, I'm going to use examples. So hand washing comes to mind, which is something I think liberal Jews don't do as much or with as much intention as perhaps some people do, some Jews do. I had a great argument with my friend Barbara Penzner, who's a Reconstructionist rabbi. Yeah. And I said, hand washing.
Her nephew is a member here.
Oh, there you go. It's a very small tribe. So we were talking about this, and I said, just you go over there and you wash your hands. She said, for me, it's a deeply spiritual moment. But I think that's the exception rather than the rule for most of us. So that's an embodied ritual. I was also thinking about the things that we remember from our past, the really powerful memories that are associated with ritual. So I keep hearing this, I remember going to shul with my grandfather, and what they remember is playing with a tzitzit, wrapping walking hand in hand, the schnapps afterwards, going back and eating. So all of those embodied moments that are attached to a kind of ritual, those are what sink in, stay with you. It's the flavor of Judaism, food, music, and embodied ritual, lighting candles on Friday night, which is a way of stopping time for at least 30 seconds, if not 24 hours. And that mumbo jumbo of moving your hands around. It's powerful. Those are powerful embodied rituals. Eating, holding up a cup, drinking, breaking bread, all of those are embodied rituals. Of course, getting under a chuppah, moving yourself into a different space, into making a sacred space. And for bar mitzvah, I was thinking not so much about the preparation, but holding a Torah in front of the adult world is this embodied, and in lots of synagogues, it's this handing down from generation. So that's an embodiment of a very heady thing. Now, mikvah, no head. It's physical. It's a physical immersion, naked. It's as elemental a ritual as you can possibly get. And every religious tradition uses water one way or another, and this is ours.
So before we kind of dive into the literally to the mikvah, your Boston Girl book begins with a question: how did you get to be the woman you are today? So I actually, it's like, how did Anita Diamant from Brooklyn and New Jersey end up becoming like the Jewish life cycle guide woman, journalist? Then like all of a sudden you're probably more known than most Jewish sources in America. When you think about the canon of what Jewish literature is, Anita, you're part of the canon of the American Jewish community in the 20th and 21st century. So I just love for us to hear a little bit about, how did you get there? Like what was the trajectory that ended up you writing this book, the New Jewish Wedding at the time, and then all the followed? And is there like a stepping stone that got you to Mayyim Hayyim?
It's an unplanned career. I did not go to school to study. I got an English degree and a comp lit degree, very helpful for careers. And I really didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. Moved to Boston and sort of fell into journalism. I was a sports writer in 1970 because, believe it or not, I knew nothing about sports, but it was Title IX, and nobody knew anything about women's sports. So I could write about women's sports, not that I ever became an expert. So that sort of started me on journalism. And I wrote for the Boston Phoenix. Anybody remember the Boston? Late lamented Boston, Oliver Shalom, Boston Phoenix, which was graduate school for me as a journalist. And while I was there, I had a column, and I could write about almost anything, and I also wrote feature stories. I wrote a feature story called Jewish Renaissance, which the rabbis hated. They should have been renewal. But because Boston was Havarat Shalom, and there was all kinds of really interesting Jewish stuff.
Same work for the
Havarat
people
Shalom,
who know.
so the beginning of the Havara movement, Rabbi Art Green and others, they still own that building in Somerville.
Wow.
And which
I went to Tufts, so.
yeah. So you knew it. So it was a place people sat on the floor and sang, and it was kind of the Jewish catalog, the child of the Jewish catalog of that ilk. So Boston still had then in the late 70s, early 80s, interesting rabbis, interesting people. Kolbo, which is a kind of interesting new form of a Judaica store run by much younger people, buying things and thinking about ritual objects in different ways. But the real thing that got me started on this was falling in love with somebody who wasn't Jewish. And so Jim Ball and I fell in love and started realizing we were having a serious relationship. And I knew it was very important to me, if we ever had a child, to raise that child as a Jew. But I did not know how to do that because I was not raised. I had no Jewish education, basically. My parents were survivors. They came to the United States after the war. We were Jewish in everything. Politics, democratic politics were Jewish. Beethoven was Jewish. And we celebrated Hanukkah and kind of Passover, but there was no regular...
Yom Kippur, anything?
I don't remember anything. We did not belong to a synagogue. My father told me this story that he went in Newark to a synagogue and they asked him for tickets, and he left and he said, tickets?
Right.
Not something you did in Europe, I guess. So when my brother was 12, we joined a synagogue so the grandparents could have a bar mitzvah. And I was 14. Mm-hmm. So I went to religious school, a big Reformed congregation with an organ, and I sang in the choir loft. But then I got involved in youth group. I got into Missouri Valley Federation of Temple Youth, NIFTY, which was very powerful. My first experience with Judaism was very positive, but I didn't know how to raise a kid as a Jew. And I didn't have that kind of community. And Boston at the time was very Irish Catholic and WASPy, and I didn't live in Brookline. I couldn't afford to live in Brookline. And so I started writing articles for the Boston Phoenix about Jewish life. So I wrote a book about renewal. I wrote a piece about renewal. I wrote a piece about shopping somewhere to go for high holiday services and not finding a place and yet going to lots of different places. Lots of stories like that about Jewish life. So I had the freedom to do that at the Phoenix. So Jim and I joined a Jewish book group and started reading together. And I started lighting candles on Friday night. I didn't know why. I didn't know what it meant. But we did it, and it was a nice thing to do. And then when we decided we were ready to get married, I called the rabbi I quoted a lot in these other articles, Larry Kushner. And I said, I asked him if he did intermarriages, because Jim wasn't Jewish. And I don't know how I said it. I could barely get the words out. And he said, let me tell you why I don't. And we had a little nice conversation. He said, but what's his name, Jim? If he wants to talk to me about converting to Judaism, I'm really happy to talk to him. So I hung up the phone and I said to Jim, you want to talk to him about converting to Judaism? And he said, yes. And he was already on a path. All of his major girlfriends had been Jewish. So he was on his way. But he
Not
was
the minor ones, just
the
the
major
ones.
I don't know about the minor ones. So I don't want to know about them. But we were sort of starting to practice to fool around with it around the edges. We had Jewish friends. We had this book group. So his introduction to Judaism class, in a lot of ways, was my introduction to his first Hebrew class was my first Hebrew class. Mm-hmm. So and I think this is a classic American story about finding your way back to Judaism because of a partner who's exploring it as well. So he had no baggage. I didn't have very much either.
Right.
And we had a great community. Rabbi Kushner was our rabbi for many years. He married us, named our daughter, and she went to religious school at that congregation. She grew up there, and she had the kind of Jewish communal life that I didn't have. So I got to give her that I didn't have. My daughter taught here, by the way, when she was at NYU. She taught in the religious school briefly. Right. Someone nodding? Amelia?
She's a terrific rap poem.
Oh, thank you. Yes, she is. She can poem. Big Tikkun Olam Jew. So that's how I became a Jew. So when we were getting married, I asked Rabbi Kushner, what should I read? He said, you should write a book about Jewish weddings because they're terrible. He really did. He did this. And I looked at the books and they didn't speak. I'm a feminist. We were going to have Jim's evangelical Christian mother at the wedding. We needed information that the books that were available were written by Orthodox rabbis or etiquette ladies. And Rabbi Kushner was teaching us about yichud, which is this incredible custom where the couple goes into a private room after the ceremony and just has a few minutes to breathe and look at each other and eat something and what did we just do? and then take a breath and go out. So I didn't read that anywhere. So I thought there was room for that book. So that's where it started.
Uh-huh. And
it kept going. There was no baby book.
Right.
I had a daughter. There was nothing. She was born in 1985, and there was nothing. There were no books that included ceremonies for daughters.
Right.
And the stuff about boys and bris did not acknowledge how difficult that is to do. So I thought, I can do this. And then no more Jewish books, I said. I don't want to be typecast. Never say
that
never.
Worked,
never
right?
say never. Yeah, then, so.
So tell us about how you ended up being the founding director. How was Mayyim Hayyim born?
I was writing a book about conversion, and so I feel very strongly about this. That Jim converted to Judaism before we were married, and he went to this mikveh in Brighton, which was pretty shabby, and Rabbi Kushner walked us through and showed us everything. We walked past the washing machines and the wigs, and he said, "You'll probably never come back here, but these people are your cousins now, and you will be this is part of your family now." So we left, and I actually went back before we got married as a bride, because at that point I thought I'm going to write a book, and I felt like an anthropologist. It was really not for me. I didn't know I was very tense, and it was not a great experience. I did it because I wanted to have the experience. And then I was the chair of the outreach committee in my congregation for a while, so I went with friends and people in my congregation for their immersions, and there was nowhere to sit. A friend of mine converted. Her elderly parents were there to support her. There was nowhere for them to sit down because Rabbi Kushner would have the Beit Din at the mikveh, which is a very powerful thing, so you go right from that into the water. And it wasn't great. It was open one day a week for non-Orthodox Jews.
That's what I heard. That's
like
the story on the street.
4 hours a week, and if it was a holiday, you didn't get that week. And I once went and, this is it. But so anyway, I decided to write a book about conversion to Judaism, and I kept going back to the mikveh with conservative and reform and reconstructionist rabbis to see the dramaturgy of what they did, because I wanted to describe it for this book. And it really started to bother me. The conservative movement would graduate a whole class, and there was a line out the door one day to convert to immerse, which is great. I mean, men, women, children.
Bring them on, right?
But it's not the way we do things. I mean, it's a very powerful choice, and it should be honored like any other big major life cycle event. And then it was shabbier, and you were asked to pay before you went in, and it was not a warm welcome. It was not the welcome I thought that we deserved, that our community deserved. If we were going to take ourselves seriously as liberal Jews, we need to offer an experience for everybody that would be open for everybody. So while I was working on that book, I wrote The Red Tent, which was called The Book of Dinah while I was writing it. And then it got published, and then I was the woman who wrote The Red Tent. So then when I started saying, we should start a mikvah, let's find someone to do this, almost anybody would talk to me because I had written The Red Tent.
Right.
So Barbara Penzner and a handful of other people in Boston, we convened a very small group, and we found that there was some response to this idea of a mikveh, not just for conversion, but for all kinds of reasons. And it was a time when I was reading articles here and there, mostly by women, about using mikveh creatively, often outside before weddings. I knew men who also had gone into the ocean before their weddings, after divorce, after illness. So people were already experimenting with this idea and sort of beginning the process of reclaiming this. Without an institution, pretty much outside.
Right.
So that's how it happened. I really tried very hard to find someone to do this. Really did not want to. I was the chair for 12 years. I never ran I never was on a I am not a committee person. So I was running meetings for 12 years because of Eliza Klein.
Right.
And
Who was the founding executive director and a friend.
And a friend, both very dear friend, and really a visionary leader and executive.
Right.
So the community got together and understood that this was important, and we've been open for 14 years, and thousands of people have come and continue to come and use it for all kinds of purposes, and it's so far surpassed all the dreams. I wrote an essay sort of fantasizing what it might look like, and all of it came true and way more.
So what's the fantasy that came true? Like, how would you describe that fantasy?
It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. It's clean. It's open. Everybody feels welcome and embraced, including the non-Jewish parents of people who come with their children to support them, or grandparents who are watching their grandchild become Jewish in the mikvah. So it's welcome. It's open to everybody. It's for everybody. Anybody is welcome to come and visit. Any Jew or person becoming Jewish is welcome to use the water. We have 7 guiding principles. I'm not going to get them all. I always feel like I'm doing the 7 dwarves. So Hidur Mitzvah is one of them. So it's a beautiful place, and we have an art gallery in it to bring people into openings so that they'll come to see a mikvah. Who would go to a mikvah for an art gallery? So education is a major part of it. We do more education than we do immersions.
Yep.
The dry side is busier than the wet side. Children from all the religious schools and the day schools come, the liberal day schools and religious schools come for a class in 5th grade or so. It is a place, it is an unhyphenated Jewish place. It is not affiliated with any institute, any movement. It's its own 501c3. And so there's that. It's for everybody. It's Ahavat Yisrael and Klal Yisrael. So we don't just tolerate everybody. We welcome and love all the Jews. Jews
That's
of
a
all,
tough
that's a tough thing.
order.
It's a tough thing. But it's good to not be affiliated. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
it's a freestanding Jewish place.
Right.
And it's totally accessible, and we continue to work hard in terms of physical access, in terms of adding materials to help people who have trouble with language or reading. It's built to be ACA accessible. We have a lift for people to go into the water who can't get down the steps.
There's a very beautiful video that includes that.
Yeah.
Someone immersing.
So if you want to see it, you go to Hayyim.org, and we have videos of what it looks like and how it's used. So the first video we did was the baby one, because Eliza and I were looking at videos online of what it looked like to take a baby into the mikveh. Oh, God. They were dark and screaming, and it was just horrible. Nobody would take a child to do that. So we have a big, beautiful one with the family singing, and it's very joyful. So there's that. It's also open to, it's gender, for everybody friendly. We have people of all sexual orientations and descriptions. We have ceremonies for everybody. We have recently, I believe, put together a ceremony for people transitioning genders. And our mikvah guides, who are they're no mikvah ladies, they're mikvah guides, men and women, and trans
Everything
people
in between.
too, and people in between, who have been trained. There's a real training process. You have to be interviewed and vetted and because it's a very sensitive job. You're witnessing people when you're naked, and you have to be a safe person. You have to be able to step back as well. So we have people of every single description that you can imagine, people who are very deeply committed in the Jewish community. We have very traditional Jews. We have people for whom this is their only Jewish institution that they're connected to. And they volunteer, and they are the face of Mayyim Hayyim. They answer the phone. They are the community in the community mikveh.
Did you get all 7? I wasn't counting.
I don't know. It's close.
Do people use it for family purity?
Yeah, we don't call it that.
Okay,
we call it monthly immersion.
Monthly immersion.
Or nidah. We'll talk about
Okay.
that. So yes, actually the most common reason people immerse statistically is monthly immersion, because you come every month.
Right.
Then the second most common, we just did the statistics, is conversion, and then people come for all sorts of other reasons. So women who affiliate with all different movements use it for nidah, and that includes Reform and Conservative and Orthodox and unaffiliated and traditional Orthodox and non-affiliated. A handful of men have also come on a monthly basis with their partner because they want to be part of that as well. We have lesbians who come, whether or not they're partnered.
Has it impacted the Brighton mikveh?
I don't know. I don't think so. They seem busy.
You haven't stolen their business.
Let 1,000 mikvahs
Yes,
bloom.
it's true.
Also, we opened this place to open mikvah to, particularly for the community that was not welcome there.
Right.
But our mikvah is kosher. That's the other one. It is built according to halachic standards, and that's what makes a mikvah kosher, is the plumbing.
Right.
And so the plumbing has been vetted and was okayed by an Orthodox rabbi who looked at the plumbing and came and watched them finish the pouring of the concrete. So, and we have a mashgiach who is, I think he's an Avi Weiss rabbi.
YCT.
Yeah, YCT rabbi. And so
Mashgiach is someone who
supervises.
supervises.
And basically they just check it every now
Either
and
the
then.
kitchen or the mikveh.
Or the mikveh. It's not. It's just to make sure that the water is being
water.
collected properly and that it's being circulated properly and used properly. That's the kashrut of the mikveh. Whatever it gets done in the mikveh, you
Right.
cannot treif a mikveh any more than you can treif a Torah scroll.
Right.
So if you give the Torah scroll to somebody who's not Jewish, it doesn't stop being sacred. And the same thing is true. People don't use the mikveh unless they are Jewish or becoming Jewish, unless you need help in the mikveh. So, for example, when someone's using a wheelchair and they have a health aid, they go in the water. And that's up to the rabbis that they're working with, but they clay kodesh their tools of holiness to help somebody else do this
So
mitzvah.
speak to the, you told me about a really powerful ritual that took place about a couple that I think that was getting married, and there was a non-Jewish groom, and what happened at the mikveh.
So lots of brides and grooms come, and grooms and grooms. We opened 7 days after marriage equality came to Massachusetts. And our 7th person was a lesbian bride who had been chased away from another mikveh because she was honest about who she was. So we said, yes, we got you. So couples, sometimes the partners come, sometimes both partners will immerse. We have 2 separate pools. Sometimes people witness one another. We don't, you're in charge of your own ritual, unless it's a conversion, in which case you need rabbinic supervision. So this bride came, she's Jewish, her groom was not Jewish, and he was really touched, and he thought this was such a beautiful ritual, and he understood that it wasn't for him. But one of the mikveh guides, he was so touched by this, she figured out a way to include him, and she went to the mikveh, she took a pitcher of water, and they did a hand-washing ceremony for him. And I since actually I think it's in the wedding book, certainly in the conversion book, there's a little blessing for somebody who, it's not a blessing in a traditional sense or in a halachic sense at all, but to talk about making this change. And he felt very included in that, and he was part of this Jewish ritual without crossing any lines, and made to feel welcome and treasured and part of it. So that's what happens at Mayyim Hayyim. We are wide open.
So what do you think makes ritual work? What's a good ritual, and what makes it work?
I made a list. I don't usually do this, but I actually thought about this. This is my list. I think, and I actually had a nice argument with Barbara Benster the other day about all of this. I don't think words are enough. I think words are important, and we are very heady, and so it can be part of the experience, but I don't think words alone are a ritual for the most part to me. the most powerful ones, I said, have drama, have a play. You move from one status to another. And so in addition to the weddings and bar mitzvahs having their structure, there's ecstatic dancing, usually around them, two people dancing in circles, which is this very ancient, universal sign of a transition going on. Dramaturgy, I think gestures and actions. Of course, the Seder is the great example of embodied ritual, right? You're doing all things at the table, and you're eating, and you're yelling at each other, and it's your child's first time drinking wine, and there's arguing, and there's loving, and there's singing, and there's more food, and there's smells, and all of that. And then the house is different for a week. So all of that is embodied ritual. So I think that's powerful. So doing something physical. Brevity. I think rituals have to be, if you're going to do a real ritual, 25 minutes is too long for a ritual. Right. Because you are approaching the holy, ineffable. And the longer you stay there, the more you start thinking about what you need to pick up on the way home. If you need milk.
I say that about baby namings and funerals a lot of time.
Yeah.
They go on too long,
yes.
People can't, it loses its power.
Right. And you want it to be short because you want people to stay in the moment. That's the tough thing with rituals, right? Is stay in the moment. So if you have an hour-long ritual, no one's staying in the moment.
Yep.
You can't. It's really not. I don't think it's humanly possible. So brevity. I think music has a lot. I think singing, and I know that intentional breathing is really important to all. I mean, I practice yoga, and that's the only place I can actually sit still and breathe. But I think singing is the Jewish breath ritual in some ways, and it does change. Larry Kushner would always say that singing changes the temperature in the room. So if you start a ritual without music, I think you're missing an opportunity. And it doesn't have to be long or complicated. It can be like 3 rounds of a nigun and done. But everyone calms down, centers, breathes, and you're in a different space. You change the temperature in the room. So those are elements. I'm curious, and I want us to talk about the difference between private, personal rituals and then public rituals. And we talked about this on the phone, too, so we've reclaimed mikvah, and mikvah is becoming much... Mikvah used to be, like, so weird. Yeah. It was just either had a negative association or just, why on earth would I do that? My grandmother told me not to do that,
right.
Kind of thing. So
also, I feel like, during the time, probably in my college, early rabbinical period, there had been 2 major articles by Rachel Adler about mikveh, she was an Orthodox Jewish woman who kind of wrote an essay. She wrote an essay about how you could make mikveh meaningful, because particularly in the Orthodox community, it was just a commanded ritual. And it obviously, I think, particularly as feminism got louder and louder, became more and more problematic given the patriarchy. And then she wrote a retraction, which I think came about during my early years in rabbinical school. And so it was like this woman who had kind of shown all the beauty of what mikveh was, and then she retracted. She kind of went back and said, essentially, no, we're actually reinforcing the patriarchy by reinventing that something that actually gives women a lack of power and makes them, subject to, I think, puts them in categories of pure and impure. And it was for someone who was trying to kind of make sense of the meaning and how to make for renewal in Judaism, it was really startling.
But she came to one of our first or second mikveh conferences, and she said, you did it. I mean, it is doable. I actually think a generation and a half of learned and learning Jewish women are in a very different position.
Yes,
and we start, and my Hayyim as an example is, we started from scratch, and it was invented, imagined, embodied, and mostly funded by women.
Right.
And so for everyone in the community, the mikveh is open to people of all descriptions, men and boys and trans and GLBTQ, the whole community, but men in particular and boys in particular are welcome. So it's not just for women.
Yeah.
But she came and she and she talked very, very how happy she was to be able to see that happen. So,
Yeah.
and she's that great example of somebody
Yep.
who started in one place and ended up teaching at HUC.
Right.
And
She was, yeah.
yeah. So this is a very different. That's an interesting change that we've
That's
lived
what I was
through.
going to
Yeah,
ask.
yeah.
Like, so given where things are, and I think there's like, how has the ritual reinvention or imagination intersected around feminism, and and how things have changed in our time?
Yeah. Well, again, I need to use stories and examples that at Mayyim Hayyim, there's an old customary use of mikvah in the 9th month of pregnancy, that you would go to the mikvah before you gave birth. You can imagine you floating. So that feels good. And it's a moment of prayer and of praying for a good birth, an easy birth, and a healthy baby. And it's a way to center. So that's part of the tradition at Mayyim Hayyim, and we have a ceremony for that, also for fathers and for partners as well. And there's some lovely blog posts about men becoming fathers and using the mikvah as a way to prepare themselves for this transition into life. And all of the transitions of women's lives, menopause, treatment for various cancers associated with women's bodies, not so much menarche. I think that's a tough thing for a 13-year-old girl. But bat mitzvah and graduating from high school and college and going away, and that's boys and girls. But using these moments in life, especially in women's lives. Women have used it after violence, in the process of healing for violence, after violence.
And what do you think, like...
We own it. This is the difference, is that we own it.
Yeah.
And when I see pictures of the, there was a rebuilding of a mikvah on the North Shore of Boston, and there was a photograph of the people who were in charge of it. It was 10 men with beards, no women. And it was shocking. Because that was built only for women, that mikvah in particular. So it's different if we own it, if we are part of the larger community and building something for the whole community. It just shifts it. We have hijacked the mikvah. I don't think we've just reinterpreted. I think we have reinvented and continue to reinvent it and broaden its use in as many ways as possible.
Right.
And it doesn't, at the beginning, people say, oh, you're watering it down, haha. But it's not a zero-sum game. It's more holiness.
Right, right. So before we get into the public-private, in the epigraph of the New Jewish Wedding, it has a quote, and it's an Abraham Joshua Heschel quote, so because particularly he, in some ways, the main rabbinic voice and theologian who informs a lot of our whole orientation here and spirituality or embodied ritual. You write, or you quote him, the main function of observance is not in imposing a discipline, but in keeping us spiritually perceptive. And the quote continues, which the second half is actually not included in the epitaph of the new version of the book, which says Judaism is not interested in automatons. So, one, why did you choose that quote? And two, why the second part of the quote doesn't appear in the second version of or the third version?
The third version. And then I did that, huh?
I don't know. Did you?
No, I did.
I didn't
I guess
do it.
I didn't think it was necessary. I think actually the first two lines say it, and the third line is a little bit of a pejorative, kind of like, ritual without intention is meaningless. Is basically what that means. Just to do it for the sake of doing it. He was arguing against that, but I think the first two lines are. They're prettier too. They're nicer.
And how did you find that? Like, had you been studying Heschel, or like, did you look for what you were trying to convey? Like, do you have?
I found that we're talking about 1984.
Yeah.
So I know I studied Heschel a little bit with Rabbi Kushner, so I'm sure that came up in there someplace.
Yeah.
So that's probably where I found it.
I also thought it was interesting, besides that, of course, the first sentence is much more beautiful. I'll say it again. The main function of observance is not in imposing a discipline, but in keeping us spiritually perceptive. And the second part, I just thought I made my own midrash between the first and the new version, this one, of the Jewish wedding now, is like in those, whatever, 35 years since, it's kind of crazy, 35 years or less, a little less, the nature of an automatic Judaism actually that has gone away to some degree. Like, I think in our spaces, what 1985 looked like in terms of kind of American Judaism, the liberal, it was like you just did it. Like and I think no longer do people just do things because you're supposed to do them. There's a lot less in 2018 of people being automatons.
Yeah.
Like, I think in our community, people are much more interested in spirituality, and there's much less just willing to put it on of that state. I think Heschel would probably have a different critique of this period of time, right? Like, maybe we should put on a little bit more. And so I just wondered, besides the beauty piece, if that resonates at all.
Yeah, I do. I think, and I actually think it has a lot to do with my voice, because this book, the first edition, looking back at the first edition of this book, it's an arc of change in the American Jewish. So in the first edition, there's the sentence that says, referring to rabbis as he and she is not, it only refers to the facts on the ground. So I felt like I had to explain that I wasn't making a political statement here. I was just describing the facts on the ground. There's also this quote about, I wrote in the first edition that liberal Judaism is authentic Judaism. And I thought I believed that at the time, but when I revised it, I unprivileged Orthodox and traditional texts in this edition. So that in the other editions, the first one was the Orthodox ketubah, and then there's the next ones. But in this one, the Orthodox ketubah is it's in the appendix. Because that's not who reads this book. This book is read by liberal Jews, which includes a big, wide range of people, including people who are quite traditional in their practice. But it's not, the Orthodox ketubah is not the primary text anymore.
Right.
It's really not. So that's a big change in me as a writer, and I think that reflects a change in the community that we are. Actually, the liberal Jewish community, in all of its diversity, is much less, we're not looking over the right shoulder so much anymore at all. I think we are much stronger and self-confident and feel that we are authentic, that this is authentic Judaism.
Right.
And it's not watered down, and it's not second-rate, and it's not the third example. This is Judaism.
So in this new version of the book, which wasn't just like an updated version like in 2001, but it's actually in many ways a new book. So what's new about it? I've been sending couples that I married to read your version of the book before for years. Like, what are they going to gain from this book versus the previous one?
Well, there's some stuff is the same. The descriptions of historical development of rituals and what happens under a chuppah and what the 7 blessings are, although they're different translations. When I told people I was updating it, they said, well, marriage equality, of course you have to update that. And that is part of this, but actually even in the first revision there was reference to partnerships, and we're Jews doing that. And this one with marriage equality, that's changed the landscape. So I have this sort of big chuppah image, which includes just about everybody who wants to stand under a chuppah. And but to me, the big change, which I got from talking to Noah Kushner and a few other young women rabbis, younger than me, was they said, you have to explain to people why they need a rabbi. So all of these books are sort of like how to shop for a rabbi, what kind of questions you want to ask, how do you want to find somebody who's right for you. But I had to make the case for the rabbi because we live in a do-it-yourself world where you can ask almost anybody to become a minister of universal life or anything to do the ceremony. So why do you need a rabbi? And
tell me.
I'll tell you. Because you know what you're doing. Because it's a skill, because it's dramaturgy, because you can hold the room, because you connect. Also, the military-industrial wedding complex, which is, this edifice, is constantly telling you it's all about you, it's your day. And of course it's all about you, but it's also as a rabbi in particular, you're connecting you to this big community, to this long tradition, to the future, to the past, to this, you make it much bigger than just about you, although you're at the center of it. So there's that. And I think the dramaturgy of the ritual, in particular weddings, which can include, should include a processional and a recessional and gathering, and who's standing here, and how do we include your parents or not, and how do we include your friends or not, and how do we keep it short? Do-it-yourself weddings tend to go on a long time. And again, it's hard to stay focused on what's happening under the chuppah.
We say, when I explained the wedding to couples, I said it has to have punch.
Yeah.
And if you have too many readings or too many explanations, it's not a class, it has to have punch, which is exactly what you're talking about.
You can do that at the celebration, the simcha. You
Right.
can have toasts and speeches and partying and all kinds of...
People don't want to listen to them there either, though.
Well, if there's enough to drink it, by then you're eaten and drunk and
Right,
just,
that's true.
and danced. So it's more appropriate there.
It is more
appropriate there.
yeah.
So that's why you need a clergy, rabbi or cantor, somebody who knows what the ritual is, who knows what the liturgy is, who knows if you want to change something, let's have a conversation about the past and who you are as a person. And so I think that's a big change in American culture and American Jewish culture and in the way we see this.
Yeah.
So I think
Look at the New York Times, right? The wedding section of the New York Times of who's marrying people.
Yeah, right.
At least 50% are not actually being married by
clergy of any kind.
Yeah, of any
absolutely.
kind. Yeah.
And so actually, and this may be radical for here, but given that that's the fact, anybody who comes to Jewish clergy and says, I want a Jewish wedding, saying no to anybody is stupid.
So we just had a huge change here, right? So that's a great segue. We went last year, I think I mentioned on the phone, through a year-long process around Jewish identity, belonging, and community, which was essentially driven by the question of whether we should be, as rabbis, officiating in interfaith marriages. And there were two major outcomes, I would say, from the process. One was that, yes, we would officiate, and two, that really the issue was not about whom you marry, but the home you build. Yeah. So our outcome essentially is to have this Jewish home project, which is going to be really about how to help people build Jewish homes, not just Jewish, non-Jewish couples, but everyone, no matter single, old, young, LGBTQ couple or not, and how do we give people the resources and support to do that, as well as also upping the visibility of conversion as a great pathway as well. And now for the last 6 months, essentially, we've been in the process of kind of designing what that ritual is, because we felt that if you want to honor the two people under the chuppah, you can't ask them to be who they're not. It's like we didn't just want to reproduce. One, the Jewish wedding in and of itself has some challenges because it is not an egalitarian wedding at its core. And two, that when you have a non-Jewish person standing under the chuppah, which is the chuppah is representative of the Jewish home, but we didn't want to ask the non-Jewish partner to say, behold, you are consecrated to me according to the laws of Moses and the people of Israel, because it's not theirs in a certain sense. So we've been in a design phase of what is the ritual. So I'm curious in terms of how you think about, as ritual changes, as who belongs in ritual changes, what are the, particularly around interfaith weddings, although even we spoke about...
You cannot use the word interfaith.
Interfaith, it's a terrible... One of the things we've been talking about is how do you come up with new language, since really everyone who we're going to marry is building a Jewish home. So is it a Jewish marriage? Is it a marriage of whatever? So there's a paucity of language around these kind of questions. But I'm interested in how you think about, given also where you were with Jim all those years ago, and would it have been different now, given the nature you think he would have converted?
I don't know.
Knows?
You can't. I really have no.
Right.
No, who knows?
No, but and what would the ceremony what do you think is important about who two people stand under the chuppah who are not Jewish? But only one of them is Jewish.
I think making a policy is probably a mistake. I think two stories. One is I went to a wedding many years ago of a couple. It was a Kennedy wedding. Sean Kennedy was marrying somebody named Dina. And it was another Kennedy wedding that weekend, by the way, but it wasn't this Kennedy wedding. He wore a kittel. There was a chuppah. It was a Jewish ceremony. His family's minister read this beautiful reading, which is the about love, and it's just a beautiful poem. It's not. And afterwards, somebody asked him about the interfaith wedding. He said, that was a Jewish wedding. That was a Jewish wedding. He married in. He hadn't converted. He wore that kittel at his son's bris. Right. Okay? He married in. And there's a lot of that going on. And that, by the way, used to be one way people became Jewish. You just joined. You just entered the tent, and your children in particular, nobody questioned their authenticity as Jews. So there's that. And in this book, there's Rachel Adler's Brit Ahuvim. And now it's in the middle of the book. It's not in the appendix. Brit Ahuvim is, so Rachel Adler, again, is this person we mentioned before, who's a theologian and a writer who wrote about mikvah, and she also created this ceremony which uses a lot of traditional language and gestures from the past, and it feels very much like a Jewish ceremony, and it uses Hebrew and it uses English, and instead of kinyan, which is the acquisition of one to the other, it's based on partnership law, and there's you hold up a bucket or a basket or some kind of a plate or something, and they both put something in it together, and then they take it down. That's usually rings, and they share rings. So it's a reinvention of the wedding completely, and she has a whole halachic explanation
it's all
of it.
explained in her book, Engendering Judaism.
Right. And her son and daughter-in-law have then done Brit Ahuvim 2, which is even more. There's even more halacha about it. So she bases this in Jewish law. It feels like a Jewish wedding. It sounds, it smells, it tastes like a Jewish wedding. It's not exactly. But you can raise a chuppah over it, and everybody feels welcome. And it's not fake anything, but it's a Jewish wedding. So the interfaith language is worthless. People are marrying in. An interfaith wedding is when there's a minister and there's a rabbi there. But for the most part, people are just coming, and if somebody wants to be married under a chuppah, given the fact that you don't need a rabbi anymore, why would you say no? I mean, we live in a different world, and it's time to really make this a really big chuppah, a big tent. So I think that's where we find ourselves now in a way that even 10 years ago, I don't think that was true.
It's really different.
But if those announcements in the New York Times, are that's the evidence. That's the evidence.
Great. Okay, I just want to go down one other path around. I sent you this article, but I read this article on The Atlantic by Emily Smith, and it's called In Grief, Tripersonal Rituals. And so there's a study done by researchers Michael Norton and Francesca Gino at Harvard Business School, wanted to know how people cope with extreme loss. In the study published in February in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, they found that some mourners are more emotionally resilient than others, and those who overcome grief more quickly all have something very important in common. Following the loss, they performed what the researchers referred to as rituals in the study. But these were not your typical rituals. When many people think of mourning rituals, they think of public displays of bereavement, such as funerals, wearing black for a certain period of time, or religious customs like sitting Shiva in Judaism. So then they ask all these people how they cope with the loss, and the researchers were surprised by the results. Many of the rituals reported were not the public ones that inspired Norton. Rather, they were private rituals. Only 15% of the described rituals had a social element, and just 5% were religious. By far, most of the rituals people did were personal and performed alone. So the whole article is about that the resilience seemed to have a shared notion that the ritual wasn't like, hey, Jewish ritual, even though many people, I think, particularly in mourning, find the rituals of Judaism particularly compelling and holding, but that resilience was tied to the ability to ritualize the grief in some form. And so I'm curious, given your experience, Mayyim, Hayyim, and the mikveh in some way is both public and private, right? Like it's both traditional and scripted in some way, yet deeply personally created. And I'm curious about your experience of what you've witnessed in how Mayyim Hayyim is both changed the public perception of mikvah, as well as created very deeply personal experiences for people and marking things in personal ways. And also in your own life, how that kind of public and private, the imagination of being able to create ritual allows us to be more resilient.
Ooh, that's a lot of questions.
I know.
I'll talk about the mikvah.
Please.
I'll always talk about the mikvah. It's a very private ritual. Even when you have, if you're a bride or a groom and you have your whole family outside in the atrium, their doors are closed, but they can hear you. You're still alone in the mikvah. You don't have to have a witness for most immersions. If you want one, she's there, he's there. Being very careful not to look, actually. But you're alone in the water. You go under the water. There's no sound except the sound of your own heartbeat. So you own this split-second moment of being alone, and people really talk a lot about connecting to God or just letting go, being able to cry, being able to give permission to start over again, all sorts of things. So it is profoundly, it's an intimate experience. You're naked. You just spent time getting rid of everything on your body, and there's no more intimate, personal, private moment than that. Some people come to Mayyim Hayyim all alone. We don't know, they'll say, I'm here for a life transition. They'll go into the preparation room, they'll go into the mikveh without a guide and just call when they're ready to come out. And sometimes the people in the front hear them crying or singing, and that's their own private ritual. And for some people it's profoundly religious, and for some people it's not. A very good friend of mine lost her mother a few years ago. Very bad relationship. Really unhealthy relationship. Was a big relief to her when her mother passed away, but she was having she's a therapist, very hard time settling. So I gave her a certificate, and she said, you really don't know me if you're giving me a mikveh certificate. You know. They sent their kids their daughter to the Workman's Circle School, no God. Right. So she said she finally came to the mikveh, and she went into the water, and they expunged all the God language out. And she left, and she said, that really made an enormous difference. It helped. It helped a lot. It had nothing to do with why. She couldn't tell me. There's something about water. We all know there's something about water. Those of us in particular who go to beaches and lakes and rivers for lots of reasons. And just immersing. If you've been sick ever and you get out of bed and you get a shower or a bath, it just revives you. So there was something in that moment and being held in this quiet, beautiful, safe space that she could let go. And this is an atheist, up and down, and culturally Jewish, and that's it, and probably won't ever do that again. And yet, she found it really, and she actually wrote a blog post about it. I ask everyone to write blog posts about them. So there's a personal ritual, but because she had this structure and the opportunity to think about it and had to drive there and take a shower and slow down and look in the mirror and go in the water, there's something about being held by something that's bigger than you. Yeah. And that to me is a ritual. Yeah. Even stripped of its religious trappings. There's something about that is a ritual. The rituals that were described in that article are very interesting. And actually, my mother passed away not long ago, and I had this giant bag of condolence cards and letters, and I didn't know what to do with them. I don't want to keep them forever. So Barbara said, hold on to them for a year, and at the end of the year, then you can get rid of them, and we'll figure out what to do with them. We can bury them or burn them or whatever you want. But that, to me, is not a ritual. It's a personal parenthesis on something else. And when I wrote the Saying Kaddish book, which I wrote the year after my dad died, I have never been more impressed by the psycho-spiritual wisdom of our tradition because it gives you a way to hold the grief in your own life. And, you know, I understand this, but I also have so many friends who have no religious underpinning, who spent their first year after their parent died a mess because they had nowhere to put it. They had no frame for it. They had no language for it.
Yep.
And whether saying Kaddish every day or once a week, it is just to have an intellectual frame, an emotional frame, a spiritual frame, and a cultural frame for that. To me, ritual also, the most effective stuff, it attaches you to a larger community. Something bigger.
Yeah.
So people call the Super Bowl a ritual.
Right.
And the 4th of July is a ritual, and Thanksgiving is kind of a ritual because there's food, and it's, you know, there's a little bit more. But those to me aren't rituals. It's a national celebration, but it doesn't have the, you know, the emotional satisfaction that a ritual does. That's me. I think it's really a wonderful conversation and debate to have about what's a ritual, what counts, and everybody's going to define it differently too on some level, right?
Right, great. So last question, and then we'll open up to questions in the group. If Jewish life gets codified over time and rituals and liturgies get included in the canon of what it means to be Jewish, as it has for thousands of years, what do you think the code will be about the mikveh in 200 years? What do you think the impact of Mayyim Hayyim has been?
I think Mayyim Hayyim has opened the door to the mikveh so that it belongs to the entire Jewish people. And I think it's a testament to I think the big change in our lifetimes, and which is going to carry forward, is the fact that the intellectual, spiritual, emotional capacity of the Jewish people has been doubled thanks to the inclusion of women on all these levels. And that's the most radical change. So we women and in community with men have recreated things with that wisdom, with that emotional intelligence, with that life experience, with these bodies. And I think that's an expression of this larger change. So I think that's true. I think your presence on a bima and your intelligence and what you write and what you teach and preach is part of this as well. I think that's what's going to be written in that this was this incredible flowering of Judaism for lots of reasons. And I think it's an American phenomenon, right, at the beginning at least. And I think it's the full participation of learned and learning and respected and strong women.
Thank you. Great. So I want to thank, I'll thank Anita now and at the end, and we'll open up for questions. I'm going to say questions. So we sometimes have a problem understanding what question means. Question means something directed to Anita that she can answer, and that is not a grandstand. There will be time. I actually really feel like part of the opening of the Center for Prayer and Spirituality is really to open the door to this conversation. This is one of the pillars of the center's purpose, which is really to have conversations about, one, how do we mark moments in our life that we don't know how to mark? And by the way, I often in my rabbinic pastoral work do send people to the mikveh, and we happen to be lucky to be in a city that, even though it has an Orthodox-run mikveh, is extremely open to us. Most of the time, when I say I tell people to say to Gita, who's our main mikveh lady, it's for spiritual purposes, and she just lets people go. And we also have Immerse New York in our city, which has accompanied people really based on all the work of Mayyim Hayyim. But what I want to say to Anita is, the gift of what you've opened up has been a gift, I think, as a woman and as a rabbi and as a pastor and as a dramaturgist, has really not only opened mikveh, it's opened the door to how to think about opening things that feel closed. So it's not only a mikveh, it's what do all these other rituals, they don't have to stay the way they are, which I think particularly for women, but not only living in here we are at the week of Parashat Yitro and the giving of the Torah, and how authority and patriarchy have been used to shape the tradition doesn't mean it's an end in and of itself. And to stay in the conversation, to own how we can own the tradition and rebirth it, to translate it to what ritual and liturgy is meant to be. And I think all of us in some way have been transformed by the work of Mayyim Hayyim, by Anita's guidance in all these life cycle rituals, and all the incredible people at Mayyim Hayyim who have built something that is not only about a particular moment, but a mindset of what Abraham Joshua Heschel is speaking about at that opening of the new Jewish wedding, and now the Jewish wedding now. So we'll take questions. Cantor Dave Mintz and Kristen Kiersey, who's our program assistant for Center for Prayer and Spirituality, are happy to, and please say your name. I know your name, but you can say.
Hello, I'm Tobias. Thank you for speaking. I'm wondering, in a narrow lens and in a wider lens, the narrow being, could you go into greater depth about why Mayyim Hayyim is closed off to non-Jewish participation? And in the wider lens, what is it about having a Jewish umbrella for ritual as opposed to just saying rituals writ large have value and we should investigate them?
The question about non-Jewish use of the mikvah is a kind of a community standards thing, so that every 2 years or so, the Messianic Jewish community makes its case. And we have, for the past several years, we convene a group of rabbis who are kind of our advisory board, and they have this conversation again. And that's, it's not entirely up to me. I'm not sure that would be my decision, but that's the decision of the community for the moment. At the same time, everybody, unlike the Mormon Church, which is, you're open when it opens and that's it, we invite people to come in. We've had clergy from different traditions come in. And I have to say, for the most part, when we've explained to people why it's only for Jews, especially people who are churched already and have a religious tradition, they have no problem with that there's a line there. But it comes up again and again, and I'm not sure it's going to be like that forever. Okay, it's not a satisfying answer. I'm not satisfied with it either. But it's fluid. We like to keep things fluid. All water puns are okay. And the other one, why Jewish? Why stay Jewish? I mean, it's a great flavor. I mean, one can be spiritual in a very untethered way and meditate and not be a Buddhist and just meditate. But the tradition informs it and gives it tam, as the Yiddishists would say, and flavor and tradition and history. And it's layers and layers and layers. And it's all something we choose. There's no fences really around anything anymore. So this is something one chooses to be Jewish, and how to be Jewish, and how much to be Jewish, and how to do it. So it's not enforced somehow anymore. So to me, it's a matter of choice. And it's a very rich, beautiful tradition, and people are drawn to it. Not everybody, not all Jews. Lots of people who aren't Jewish are drawn to it too. So it's a rich tradition. It's got architecture, it's got art, it's got music, it's got poetry, it's got just about everything. Humor. I'm big on humor.
Great.
My name is Penina.
Penina.
We know each other. So I have 2 questions. Am I allowed 2 questions?
Sure. For
the
Penina.
price of one? Okay. First, for the first question, is a personal one. I'd love to know what story, when you were young, maybe earliest remembered story, or sometime when you were a child, a young girl, had an impact on you that you wanted to hear over and over, either to read it over and over or have somebody in your family tell it to you over and over?
Are you asking about something Jewish? Okay. No.
It's an open question of what story that you particularly loved and remembered and carried with you. And the second question, Anita, is what role do you see as that narrative or story has in ritual? role does it play in ritual?
Well, I think Passover is the perfect example of the story in ritual, and it's the powerful story, and it gets referred to in the Torah over and over and again. And we were strangers, and here we are, and now we're not anymore. And every year we reenact this. So I think that's the big narrative. And I remember hearing an African American minister, I think it was, talking about how Jews have made slavery into this narrative of freedom. And he thought that was very interesting. And how could the African American community do that? Is it possible? Is it too soon? It's 300 years. It's not that long ago. But I thought that was an interesting idea about what a story can do for you. And actually, Larry Hoffman's book talks about story and metaphor in particular as the way Jewish spirituality is expressed. So there's that. Personally, what I remember, I have such a terrible memory. I remember being read children's books by my dad. I remember the cadence of his voice, and I remember one book with a mouse in it who was being read to, and the mouse said, and I could listen and listen and listen. And if anybody knows what that book is, please tell me. So my brother remembers it too. So it's one of those stories that my father was a big reader, and he read that to us, and that was our favorite. It was about a mouse that liked books. Not just to eat them, but also to listen to them. Yeah, I should go there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Ellen. I'm a big fan of your work, and we did use your book when we got married, and we had a fabulous wedding, partly thanks to your book. But I have two questions. I'd like to know what you think about it. One, I'm a therapist, and I run bereavement groups, and I was running bereavement groups, especially during the days of AIDS, where there were a lot of AIDS widows and people losing their partners and not being able to express it. And there was someone in my group who was, his partner, they couldn't marry at that time. His partner was Jewish, but he was Irish Catholic. And he talked about saying Kaddish every day for his partner, and it was very reassuring to him. But he was very worried that he was sinning or something would happen to him because he was not Jewish doing this Jewish prayer. So I wonder what you would think of in those cases, responding to someone where the ritual was so helpful to them.
That's so great. Mm-hmm. Of course, yes. I think that's powerful in the fact that he found something that connected him to his beloved, and clearly that was the connection. He wouldn't have just picked it out of the air. And he found it comforting, and he found a way of staying connected. And that's why people say Kaddish every day or every week. That's the reason. And one of the reasons I loved when I was doing the research for this is that if you do that, if you say Kaddish at some point on a regular basis, it allows you to live the rest of your life without guilt. That it's a time to face the grief and the loss, and because you feel so much guilt for enjoying your life, moving on, but to know that you're coming back, to acknowledge that this is part of who you are as well. So I think it's.
And the other question just is, when I turned 50, I had what was called a kroning. It wasn't necessarily a Jewish ritual, but I'm wondering whether at the mikvah there is a concept, or maybe you're writing about it, the concept of wisdom, of honoring older women's wisdom or passing it on, or in some ways, passing wisdom on and honoring age.
We have a lot of people come for milestone birthdays. So 50, 60, 70, 80. One guy came at 84 just because he said, I wanted to have that experience. He'd never been in a mikveh, so that was his 84th birthday present to himself. So people use this as an opportunity and convene friends. Sometimes, very often, people have a birthday party kind of afterwards. And it's just a way of saying, this is how old I am now, and something's ended and something else is beginning. So not so much kroning, which I gotta say I'm not nuts about that word, and that aging is part of life, but to acknowledge that things have changed. People go when they retire. People go on becoming grandparents. That's another that slipped my mind. But so that happens a lot. Also, when several people I know who whose mother or father lived to the age of 54 and then they were 55. So they went on their 55th birthday or their 54th birthday to remember their parents' death and the fact that I have more years ahead of me. So it's a moment, again, of remembering your parent and the fact that you lost them at some point, usually early on in life, but you give yourself permission to keep going somehow. But again, because there's this water ritual, it becomes what you need it to be.
I'm gonna.
Yeah.
I would just say, for people who don't know, there is a website called ritualwell.org, which does have, I believe actually there is a wisdom ceremony on Ritual Well, and it has many different differently than Mayyim, which is all water based. But although they have great curricula now that are also about, there's a post-conversion curricula that just came out, or post-chuppah. So Ritual Well is a way, if you're looking for ceremony, and this is also something that we're hoping to build here, we're not recreating Ritual Well, but we recognize that there are moments in people's lives that they want to mark, not only through mikvah, and we're hoping that's what the retirement group is about. It's like, maybe that mikvah will become part of the retirement ritual that we're in the process of creation. But there are spaces and websites that have that kind of imagination around ritual. So Ritual Well is one of them. It's a Jewish Ritual Well website. Deborah? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Deborah Eater. My question is there a particular role of ritual in your writing?
That's cool. Coffee and walking the dog. And it's like, no.
So
cleaning the desk, which can also become an end in itself.
Do you sit down at the same time every day? Do you write a certain number of pages, et cetera, et cetera?
No, I write to deadlines, so I know what's coming. You're a journalist, man. That gets beaten into you. It's like it's due, so I arrange my work to meet a deadline. So no, I don't. It doesn't work like that for me. Which doesn't mean I'm not always thinking about something. So when I'm walking the dog, I'm writing, and when I'm washing the dishes, I'm writing. So, but I don't say, I'm going to write this. I have friends who write. I'm going to write 300 words today. I'm going to write 3 pages today. And I'm going to work from 8 in the morning until 2, but that's not me.
One more question related. When you think back to the time, for example, when you were writing about Dina and the red tent, did that have more of a ritual assigned to it? Because that wasn't deadline driven.
No, that was historical fiction for me. I did not write that as a religious book. It was not biblical commentary.
Religion, I'm talking about fiction.
No, I know, but but it was fiction. I was writing I was doing something I had never done before, which was fiction. So it was an experiment. It was a thought experiment, and I gave myself. I did say, okay, I'm going to work on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but the other 3 days of the week I have to make a living. So, but that's not ritual to me. That's time management.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious, just because you brought up, Deborah, the writing and ritual with writing. There is the notion of the ritual of going to the mikvah before writing a Sefer Torah. Like every time someone writes, a scribe, a sofer or soferet, writes a Sefer Torah, they have to go to the mikvah. I'm curious if there's been any use of that with Mayyim Hayyim.
Not around writing. No. There's a great story, I don't know if this is true or not, but it should be true, that before the printing of, the Kabbalah, they took apart a printing press, and they took it piece by piece to the mikveh.
To the mikveh?
And I don't know if it's true. It's a great story.
Oh, that is a great story.
It should be true. But they took it apart, they immersed it, and then they put it back together again, and they printed it.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I don't know. It's great, isn't it? That's right.
No.
Hi, I'm Valerie.
Oops.
I'm Valerie. I appreciated a lot of the dialogue about ritual. And when I think about mikvah, I think door to door. And I didn't grow up with my mom talking about mikvah.
Generation to generation.
Just generation to generation. And I have 2 young girls, and they've grown up hearing me talk about mikvah and watching me leave to go to the mikvah. So I'm curious, also you said there's the dry side and the wet side, and there's the educational component. And I think of Rosh Chodesh, it's a girls' thing, and we're a group of moms and dads and grandmothers and grandfathers. How are you teaching what mikvah is and what it can be?
Okay, we have phenomenal teachers at Mayyim Hayyim. Lisa Berman has been there since the very beginning, and she's sort of she's spectacular. So there's curriculum for kids and it's not, we are never talking anyone into using the mikvah. What we try to explain is what it is. This is part of your heritage. This is here for you when you need it. And it's a really creative, wonderful curriculum. And kids go on a scavenger hunt in the mikvah, and they have to find things here and there. It's very age appropriate. And they go to the basement and look at the plumbing. And so it's demystified, but at the same time, it becomes just part of Jewish life. It's on the table. It's part of the Jewish world. And one of the very early founders, Paula Brody of the place, said her fantasy was for kids to go to Masada in Israel and for someone to say, you know what that is? That's a mikveh. And all the kids from Boston will say, oh, I know what, I've been to a mikveh. I know what a mikveh looks like. And I also want to say that it's no longer so weird, and that I remember we had a group of kids come in, they were going to come from Brandeis, high school students, and they were worried about using Mayyim Hayyim as a site to do an art project because they thought nobody would know what it was. So we went and talked to them, and I said, who here has ever been to, or anyone you know has been to a mikveh? And almost all of them put their hands up because so many of their parents had converted. So it's part of people's lives now, in a way, and I think part of the openness about conversion as opposed to whispering about that we should celebrate these things, and this is just part of how people become part of how you get to be Jewish. Is one of the ways you get to be Jewish is by converting. It's just there, and so with fifth graders they don't talk so much about sexuality. With high school students they talk more about that, but they talk about transitions. And we had one little girl, very precocious, who had come with her father on a tour, or I think an older sibling had been in a class, and she was graduating from preschool and going to first grade. And she said, can I go to the mikvah? And she did. She came with her parents. So she got it.
So people know, we do bring our Kadima kids, our after-school program, to the mikvah. I used to be in 6th grade. I think now it's in 5th grade. I bring the girls. Rolly has brought the boys, or some other. And it's amazing, that if you say all the times traditionally when people go, they understand the why of that. They immediately say transitions. Like, kids understand transitions, and then if you ask them, well, what are other options of when you could go? They come up with a bazillion answers. Driver's license, bat mitzvah. It's a very natural. Once it's taken out of this context of what it used to be, and it is opened up, and people understand that, it's like very free and natural in terms of how. And once people know that people go, and I've definitely taken people to the mikvah, and people now go on their own for many, many different reasons in the community. Once our women's group went to visit the mikvah, you can always go. The mikvah is open at night in the city for women, only for women at night. So you can go check it out. I mean, there's nothing that we're trying to make it part of the conversation and part of the normative part of the conversation, as opposed to it being obscure, because it's no longer obscure.
And I would just say that bar and bat mitzvah kids who do come, some of them do and more of them do, and if your older sister or brother did it, you do it too, so it's becoming a little bit more normative. They almost all say the same thing, which is, now I'm ready.
Right.
Because it's so hectic and it's so crazy and it's quiet, and usually you're not there with your whole family, but now I'm ready. Some of them talk about feeling God in the water, but readiness, it's centering, and they don't necessarily have that language, but you hear that over and over again. I'm ready. Now I'm ready.
Right, and one other example I'll give of how the Moving Traditions high school boys group went. If you can get high school boys to a mikvah, and there was some writing that they did about it, it was astounding how powerful it was. Now, obviously, you have to have a safe space for the boys to be willing to do that, and an amazing teacher, which they did in David Lieberman. But that they were willing, it just speaks to people.
It's just no longer weird. We had a letter from an educator she had a 5th grade group, and it was all boys, just out of the blue, and she thought, oh goodness, we're taking boys to the mikveh. They had a great time.
Yep.
They were free. They
don't.
spent a lot of time in the basement. They thought that there's all this huge plumbing equipment in terms of, so they were fascinated by that. But then they came upstairs and talked about how they would use it. And she said, I was so surprised. But we sort of underestimate our boys.
We do.
We do. So.
Yeah.
It's here. Oh.
Here on 74th Street, between right near Fairway, kind of almost next to Cafe Margot, 74th between Broadway and West End. On the south side of the street, there's a sign. It says mikveh in Hebrew. You have to make an appointment for things that are not at night for women, which is nida. But you can go at night as a woman without being a nida. You might wait online. And then there's also a toveling mikveh, which is to kasher things, which is next door.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Miller. Thank you for your presentation. I'm moved by the story of rebirth of ancient ritual, which I have very negative connotations to, and the stories of survival of this. And you mentioned in passing your parents being survivors, and if that's a coincidence, as a child of survivors, I find that sort of just drives my whole craziness in terms of what brings on your choice of writing and narratives and stories and survival.
I don't think so, but my therapist doesn't think so. But it's part of who I am, but it's not a driver. My parents, like many survivors, did their best to protect me from their stories. Also, they were very fortunate in that their own personal stories. They both got to Switzerland. They lost family. But my father's immediate family, my mother and my grandmother, survived in Switzerland, and not to say they weren't marked and scarred by the war, but it was different. And so it's funny when I don't remember learning the word Holocaust. I think it was like chair. It was just part of the world. But so maybe I'm fooling myself. But who knows? Sorry. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. So I come from an Orthodox background, and I'm just wondering what you think the role is of halacha in ritual. So I know you spoke about the Brit Ahuvim, how it has this great halachic explanation and background, and I found that so interesting. And so I'm just wondering, as we play with ritual and as we reinvent ritual, how does halacha fit into it or not fit into it, perhaps?
I think that's very individual and communal. So the point of Mayyim being a kosher place in terms of the facility is to make sure that everybody on the whole spectrum feels like that it belongs to them, and that's true. I mean, there are mikvahot run by Chabad. Men are not allowed. There are no conversions there. There are mikvahot for women and men. Orthodox mikvahot in Boston, in the Boston area as well. So we have quite a cadre of women who I think for whom halacha is very important, and that's their use of the mikvah, is to perform this mitzvah that they take very seriously and enjoy. So for them, that's at the center of it. It's not at the center for other Jews, but I do think the connection to the past and to this tradition of understanding and explaining it is part of the draw, because it's old. There's this whole, it's humanly old and it's Jewishly old. Every religious tradition does something with water. And this one, it takes us all the way back to maybe coming from the water and coming from the womb. It's that elemental. And it's also elemental in terms of Jewish practice as well. So I think that they're connected, but it varies, I think, from person to person. And we are very respectful of people's understanding and use of the facility. It's a neutral facility. It's up to you as a Jew.
Thank you very much. My name is Linda Marshall, and as you were speaking, I was trying to remember my first cognition of ritual, and I couldn't. I don't remember as a child being aware of ritual. And I don't know if that's other than the Passover.
Me too. And candle lighting for Hanukkah.
Then I went from Passover to candle lighting. And then, as you were speaking, I began to think about silence and the importance of silence in ritual. And the water, at least to me, epitomizes silence because you can't hear anything. And it's really alone time. And I'm curious where you're going with the concept of ritual, and maybe if you've thought about it from a kid's perspective. That's my question. Ritual from a kid's perspective. A little kid, not a.
No, we actually have, there are 7 kavanot for when you prepare. If you go to any mikveh, there's a list on the wall of what you need to do before you get in the water. You have to brush your teeth and floss your teeth and wash between your nails and take off your nail polish if it's old, and so on and so forth. So instead of that, we have 7 kavanot, which include wash your face, look in the mirror, bestselling Elohim. And so it lists everything you need to do in God's image. So there's Hebrew and English, everything's translated. And it's so it's to spiritualize all of these different things that you do to get ready. And we have one for parents to do with little children as well. So it's translated into language that a parent would read to a child. Children come for lots of reasons, generally conversion or affirmation, as we like to call it, especially if you've been raised as a Jew your whole life and someone tells you you're not Jewish anymore, that you need to be converted. So it's an affirmation ceremony. And so we have language to translate what's kind of an adult understanding to something that children can understand. And they get it. Several parents have told me that the kids said, no, wait a minute, we have to go back and do this. We didn't do this one right. Because they understood enough what the rules were, what the ceremony was. I think liberal Jews are raising children with more ritual, with more ceremony, with more song, with more traditions that wrap around prayer as well in synagogue life. So I think and that enriches it.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you. So we thank you everyone for coming. There's a couple of things we want to thank you to Anita. Just to project moving forward, so as Cantor David Mintz mentioned, we're going to be having this ritual lab around retirement. There'll be one coming down the pike about sending kids off to college. And in March 24th, the second in the series around conversations around kind of creative ritual and liturgy, Rabbi Jan Urbach will be with us, who is one of the editors of the new Siddur that we've been using, Lev Shalem, to talk about how do you create a Siddur in that way. And we're really looking forward to continuing the conversation, not only in conversation, but actually to birth things through this and to open up our minds and to find ways that we can reinvent, invent, and renew and affirm the old and the new together. So thank you so much to Anita Diamant, who's made such an impact on all of us.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good night.